They dropped him into a jungle that didn't exist on any map. They called it recon, but the truth was buried deeper than the roots beneath his feet. What he found wasn't a mission, it was a trap, and he wasn't supposed to survive it. He knew the air was too still before the ramp even dropped. The kind of silence that doesn't belong to nature, but to something waiting to break it. The C-130 buzzed low over the canopy and through the grim green ocean of leaves below. Thomas Kellerman saw the place he swore he would never return to. 10 years out, and somehow they still found him. Called him back with a mission too vague to be real. Too quiet to be honest. Recon, they said. In and out. Track movement along the southern riverline. Identify presence and report. No engagement. No backup. And no traces left behind. But Thomas had lived through enough lies to recognize one dressed as a briefing. The younger soldiers around him joked half-heartedly. They carried gear to clean, eyes too sharp, hearts still capable of surprise. But his was dulled by memories that didn't ask permission to return. They had called it Operation Soft Echo and flown in silent. No markers, no identification, just jungle underfoot and questions hanging heavy in the heat. When the green swallowed him after the jump, he didn't flinch. His knees met the dirt like they remembered it, and his hands instinctively pulled the chute free. He stood before the others landed, crouched low and waited, listened. The jungle had a sound, a rhythm, a voice, and something about it tonight felt off. Too quiet. No insects, no rustling, no welcome. It didn't feel like stepping into foreign territory. It felt like walking into an old wound. They moved northwest as ordered, low and slow across thick terrain broken only by animal paths and the bones of forgotten villages. Vines wrapped around the memories of people no longer there. The radio clicked 3 times and fell silent. Comms were dying faster than expected. They blamed terrain again, but Thomas didn't answer, because he'd seen this before. Communication fails first, then the vanishing, then the silence. The mission was rotten, and the men were too green to see it. He didn't speak, he just watched, and waited, and marked the rhythm of the leaves underfoot. By sundown they reached the ridge and camped. Small fire, no chatter, no food, just ration, bars and alert eyes. They'd seen something shadow-shaped moving just beyond the clearing. But when they turned to chase it, there was only the wind, and a smell that didn't belong. Smoke, and ash, and something else. Decay. The kind that gets in your throat, and stays. The kind that only comes from burning what shouldn't be burned. At 0200 hours, Thomas saw the eyes again. Just past the tree line. Not human, not animal, just the kind of stare you remember from your worst night, and try never to speak of again. He didn't wake the others. He just watched back. By morning they found the marker stones. Not native, not random. Someone had stacked them 3 high in a line pointing inward, toward the mine. Not an old mine, not anymore. When they stepped into the perimeter, the trees stopped growing. Something had poisoned the earth. Fires long gone, but the echo still breathing. Radio equipment burned but arranged. Gear missing, but food left in place. The enemy had been there, and left like they wanted to be followed. Like this was all for show. And when Thomas bent down beside a scorched wall, he saw what they left for him, scrawled in charcoal. Not a message for the team, a message for him. Welcome back. And the dirt under his boots didn't feel like jungle anymore. It felt like a grave with his name already carved into the stone. He didn't tell the others what he read on the wall, because they wouldn't understand, and even if they asked, he'd lie, because the truth wasn't useful anymore, and the past. In this place was a weight not everyone could carry. They swept the perimeter in silence. The fog hadn't lifted. It was thicker now and smelled like copper and rotting wood. The younger soldier, Morales, said he saw someone standing at the edge of the tree line before dawn, but no one believed him, and Thomas didn't argue because he had seen it too. but pretending you hadn't was the only way to make it through the second day. Their orders said to locate and log enemy equipment, but everything had been deliberately stripped down to ruins. They weren't meant to find anything useful. They were meant to keep moving. Around midday, Thomas found something half buried beneath a collapsed supply crate. A boot, not standard issue, foreign, old, but with fresh mud along the sole, and a tag inside the tongue with a symbol he recognized from the 1987 border infiltration OP he'd been pulled from and sworn never to speak of again. The symbol was a circle with a bar running through it like a shut mouth. He didn't show the others. He just wiped the mud off his fingers and kept walking. Every step forward felt like walking deeper into a place time had forgotten, but the jungle remembered, and it whispered to itself constantly. Not with voices, but with movements in places you weren't looking, and sounds that vanished when you turned your head. Morales fell during the descent into the ravine, and when Thomas reached him, the kid's face was pale, and his breathing shallow, and he kept saying he didn't fall. Something grabbed his ankle. The medtech checked him for fractures, and found none. But when they cut the boot open, the skin beneath was bruised in the shape of fingers. That night, they didn't make a fire. No one wanted to draw attention. The team huddled under a cliffside. Legend tried to sleep while the jungle breathed above them, and Thomas sat with his rifle across his knees, and one hand resting on the clay pendant around his neck, a gift from someone who had died believing he'd come back. His fingers pressed it so hard, it left an imprint in his skin. At 0316 they heard it again, the footsteps, not running, just slow, controlled, confident. He raised his hand and the others froze. The footsteps circled once, twice, then stopped. No sound, no retreat, just ... gone. Thomas stood and scanned the ridge. Nothing moved, but there were new prints in the mud just beyond where their sleeping gear lay. Barefoot, large, human, but not recent. Weathered, deep, as if someone had been walking that same path for days, weeks, maybe longer. And not for the first time, Thomas wondered if they were being hunted or herded. The next morning, the lieutenant called a halt and demanded to set up a new contact point. The satellite phone still hadn't pinged through. Their window for extraction was closing, but Thomas knew they weren't being extracted. They were being erased. This wasn't recon. This was cleanup. And they were the mess someone wanted gone without making noise. He said nothing, just cleaned the mud from his rifle and stared at the trees as if they might start bleeding. They moved again before dawn because the lieutenant was growing nervous and the jungle didn't let people sleep 2 nights in a row without asking for something in return. The fog still hadn't lifted. It moved with them like a veil being dragged through the trees. Thomas walked at the front now, not because anyone told him to, but because no one else wanted to, and no one questioned him. They trusted him in the way men trust the last working piece of equipment in a crumbling machine. Just ahead, the terrain dropped into a narrow gulch where the map said there used to be a supply route used during the colonial days, but what they found instead was a wall of sharpened branches, bent into a crude barricade, half rotted and freshly painted with dark symbols, the kind that weren't meant to warn enemies, but meant to scare ghosts. Morales said it looked like voodoo, but Thomas knew better. It was older, cruder. He'd seen markings like that on an island mission back in '84, just before half his unit disappeared in a village with no name. The lieutenant wanted to burn through it, but Thomas stopped him. Fire drew eyes. Fire invited attention. He motioned to the far left side, where the undergrowth was thinner, and the team crawled through silently. Beyond the barrier, the world seemed darker, not just because of the canopy, but because the air felt heavy like a lid had been placed over the sky. No birds, no bugs, no life. Just silence and the distant sound of something dripping in intervals, too slow to be water. They pushed forward to a cluster of moss-covered stone ruins, not listed on any satellite images, not logged in any reports. Morales said it looked like a temple. The corpsman said it looked like a tomb. Thomas said nothing because what he saw wasn't the stones. It was the burn marks on them, circular, patterned, like something had exploded outward, but without sound. At the center of the ruins, they found the remains of what used to be a radio tower, melted, not destroyed by fire, warped by heat that didn't burn the trees around it. Something unnatural. The tech tried to check radiation levels, but the device glitched and shut down. They left immediately, but not fast enough. As they turned to move, Morales let out a low breath and whispered that someone was standing on the far ridge just above the ruins. Everyone froze, eyes scanned, weapons raised, but there was no one there. Just wind, and yet Morales insisted. Said he saw the man. Said he had no eyes. Just a black cloth tied where his face should have been. The team dismissed it as exhaustion, but Thomas didn't, because he had seen that exact description before. In an old mission file marked redacted and buried in a folder that had cost 2 friends their clearance. As they climbed out of the ruin, basin something snapped under Thomas's boot. A cassette tape, half melted, crushed under the weight of the mud. He pocketed it without telling anyone. That night, the wind didn't blow. The fog didn't move, but a noise came from the trees. Every hour, like a cough too wet to be natural, like something mimicking a human. Around midnight, Morales sat up in a panic, eyes wide, mouth open, no scream, just silent, trembling. He had piss running down his leg and kept pointing at the bush. Thomas raised his rifle. There was nothing there, but the kid wouldn't calm down. Said he saw the cloth again, said the man whispered in his ear, and said the forest already knew all their names. The lieutenant ordered him sedated. The medtech gave him half a dose. Thomas sat up all night again, one hand on his weapon, the other still pressing the clay pendant against his chest, like it might burn the nightmares away. At first light they broke camp in silence, because no one wanted to be the one to say what they all felt. The jungle was heavier now. The trees leaned in like they were listening. The air felt pressed down like the sky itself was pushing against their backs. Thomas moved ahead without needing orders. The others followed because instinct speaks louder than rank when fear starts whispering. Morales looked worse than the night before. His eyes were sunken, his movements slow, like something inside him was waiting to collapse. They walked until they reached a dried creek bed, where an old wooden cross stood crooked in the dirt. The name carved into the wood had faded, but the blood grooves of an old unit insignia were still visible, and Thomas knew it well. It belonged to a squad that vanished in 1985, during a covert op that was never declassified, and was buried so deep, not even the families got answers. He stared at it for a while. He didn't say a word. They moved on. The jungle narrowed, and the terrain grew unstable. The sunlight barely touched the ground. The silence around them deepened. Not like quiet in a forest, but like sound itself had been removed. Morales stopped walking, said he heard breathing behind him, but there was no one. They checked the trees. Nothing. No prints. No echo. Just silence that seemed to grow tighter around their throats. Around midday, they found a line of old crates half buried in mud. The metal was rusted and split, but inside, one of them was a torn military poncho with fresh blood still wet around the collar. The lieutenant ordered everyone to stay sharp, but his voice cracked halfway through the command. The radio buzzed for a second, a long static hum. Then silence again. They kept moving. No one asked where they were going anymore. The map had stopped making sense 2 hours ago. Thomas recognized the pattern, the slow spiral of disorientation, the way the forest folds around you when it doesn't want you to leave. Morales pointed toward a broken stone structure covered in vines. The symbols on the wall weren't native. Thomas had seen them before, once, deep in a cave on the border of Laos, where an entire 6-man team vanished without a single scream. He didn't go inside. He just kept walking. That night, they made camp beneath a rock ledge. No one built a fire. They didn't speak. The only sound was Morales muttering numbers again. A different sequence this time. Slower, like coordinates that didn't exist. Thomas lay awake staring into the black, his fingers pressed against the clay pendant around his neck. It was warm again, warmer than it should be, and in the distance something moved. Not fast, not slow, just steady. The jungle breathed around them, and the breath didn't sound human. They woke before the light changed, because none of them had really slept, and the sound of the jungle was back, but it was wrong, like a recording played. Too slow or too clean, and Thomas stood without a word, because whatever patience the trees once had was now gone. The riverbank ahead was slick and uneven, and they moved with caution, as if the ground itself might shift beneath them, like a trick of memory. Morales said, the air smelled like copper again, but stronger, this time almost sweet, like burnt meat mixed with soil. The lieutenant checked the sat-nav one last time, and when it blinked red, he stopped checking altogether. The gear was useless now. They were moving without maps, without direction, without signal. But the forest kept opening up ahead of them like it wanted them to keep going deeper. They reached a flat clearing where the grass grew too evenly, and the dirt was packed in lines, not natural. Dug, covered again. This had been a burial site once. Thomas knelt and brushed dirt from a small carved stone. It had no name, just a mark, a vertical line through a circle, the same symbol on the boot he had found earlier. Morales started shaking again. He said he could hear voices beneath the dirt, not words, just breathing. They left the clearing fast, but they didn't speak, because no one wanted to say what they all knew. This wasn't the kind of fear that followed you. It was the kind that was already inside. Before sundown they reached what remained of a medical outpost. Burned out, rotting. Flies clung to nothing. The cots inside were folded neatly, but the blood on the walls looked fresh. One bed had a set of restraints still clipped to the frame, and a single tag marked 1983. Thomas found a photograph under the cot, half-scorched. A team, American uniforms, but the faces were crossed out with black marker, not scratched, marked, like someone wanted to keep their identities hidden from the dead. Morales stared at the photo too long. Thomas took it from him and kept it. The team moved on. That night the fog returned, but it didn't settle on the ground. It stayed in the trees, high, circling, watching. They set up camp near a ridge with a single narrow path leading down toward what Thomas knew must be the last place they were meant to find. A compound, or a shrine, or a grave. They would know by morning. He didn't sleep. No one did. And around midnight, the jungle exhaled. A sound like trees cracking under pressure. The air grew heavier, and Morales whispered that he saw the cloth. Again, tied around the trees, hanging in strips, in shapes, in letters. And when Thomas finally looked, he didn't see cloth. He saw skin, pale, empty, hung like warnings. And it meant they were close. They moved before the light touched the trees, because waiting felt dangerous now, like the jungle might change shape if they stayed still too long, and Thomas led them toward the path he had seen the night before, the one that curved down the ridge like a scar through the undergrowth. The others followed without speaking, because their eyes told the story, their mouths couldn't form anymore. And Morales walked in the middle of the formation, as if the shadows around him might close in if he left the group for even a second. The slope was steep and lined with roots that looked like old hands reaching out from the dirt, and at the bottom the trees opened into a circular basin, where the air no longer moved and the light dimmed like something above had pulled a veil across the sky. At the center of the basin stood a stone structure, not tall, but heavy, like it had grown from the earth, rather than being built. And it was covered in moss, but underneath the stone was clean, like something had been brushing it regularly, keeping the markings visible and sharp. Thomas stepped forward while the others waited near the edge, and he ran his hand over the wall, feeling the grooves and the shapes and the message. That wasn't written in any human language, but still made sense to him somehow, like a memory whispered through bone. Morales called out then, said he saw movement inside the structure, a flicker of light, a shadow moving against a deeper blackness, and Thomas raised his rifle and stepped through the narrow entrance. The interior was cold, like walking into a cave, where no sun had touched for centuries, and the walls pulsed faintly, not with sound, but with pressure, as if the very stone was breathing around him, slow, deep, and ancient. At the center of the room there was a metal chair bolted to the ground, and the straps on the armrests were frayed but stained, and beside it was a table with a set of tools, none of which belonged to any medical kit Thomas had ever seen. They were sharp but irregular, shaped for cutting but not for healing, and behind the chair there was a wall covered in photos, all the same man, different ages, different uniforms, same eyes, and one of those photos was of Thomas himself. The lieutenant stepped in, then saw the wall, and backed out without saying a word, and outside Morales was on his knees again, whispering that the jungle knew them all, and that the man with no eyes was inside his head now. Thomas pulled the photo from the wall, stared at it long and hard, and then folded it slowly and slipped it into his vest, because even though it made no sense, he knew the photo was real, and it was waiting for him long before they ever landed. The fog crept into the structure, and with it came a low humming that had no source, no pitch, no direction, just presence. And when Thomas looked back at the chair, he saw it was no longer empty. There was a shape sitting there, motionless, covered in a cloth that moved even though there was no wind. And he stepped back slowly, because he knew whatever was underneath was not meant to be seen. Thomas didn't speak when he exited the structure, but the look in his eyes told the rest of them everything they needed to know, and no one asked questions, because even the lieutenant had seen the photo wall and understood that something deeper than war was unfolding around them, and whatever had started here didn't belong to any mission, any country, or any official truth. Morales stood with his hands shaking, but his voice was calm as he pointed up toward the ridge and said they were being watched, not from the trees, but from beneath the ground, and that the roots were listening to everything. The fog hung lower, now sliding between their boots and curling around their legs like a warning that didn't need language. They hiked further east along a trail that didn't appear on any map, but Thomas knew where it led because he remembered it from dreams he never spoke about, and the terrain bent slowly into a spiral, as if the land itself had been carved by something not human, not chaotic, but precise. They reached a stone platform split in the center with a narrow passage descending into darkness, and Morales said this was the place he had seen every night since they entered the jungle, and that if they went down only one of them would return. Thomas didn't hesitate. He stepped into the tunnel, and the others followed. The descent was steep, and the walls were too smooth for natural stone, almost as if the space had been burned through instead of carved, and the deeper they went, the quieter it became, until even their footsteps made no sound. At the bottom, the passage opened into a chamber, lit by no source, yet bright enough to see, and at the center stood a machine built from pieces of different decades, gears and switches from the 60s, solder points from the 80s circuit boards that hadn't existed yet. Thomas walked toward it slowly, his breath steady and shallow, as if his lungs knew not to disturb the air. And when he reached the machine, he saw it wasn't running, it was remembering. A screen flickered on its surface and played static shaped like faces, like silhouettes in reverse light, and for a moment one of those shapes looked exactly like him. Morales backed away. The lieutenant whispered that this was not a weapon, was a recorder built to watch pain and preserve it. In the room itself was an archive of suffering, not history. Thomas touched the side of the machine and felt warmth, not from power but from memory, as if it had absorbed the agony of every soldier who had entered this place and stored their last thoughts forever. Then a sound echoed through the chamber, not a voice, but a vibration like a name being pronounced inside the blood. They left in silence. No one looked back, and when they reached the surface again, the fog was gone, but the jungle was still watching. They moved without rest because something in the air had changed, and even the birds had stopped pretending they belonged here. And Thomas led them away from the spiral chamber with one hand on his rifle, and the other pressed against his chest, where the pendant now felt heavier than bone. Morales no longer spoke, unless spoken to, and even then, his words came out slow like they were passing through layers of water, and his eyes had turned glassy, like someone watching the world from the wrong side of a mirror. They reached a ridge overlooking the valley, and below they saw movement, not people, not vehicles, but flashes of light that came and went in perfect rhythm like a code being transmitted from the ground itself. And the lieutenant checked his scope, then dropped it, because what he saw didn't make sense. There were shadows moving across the field, but they cast no reflections, and their legs didn't bend the way human joints should, and when Thomas looked through his lens, he didn't see shadows. He saw uniforms, American, French, Chinese, Russian, all eras, all faded, all walking in a silent formation toward the river. Not one of them made a sound. Not one of them looked up. And yet they all moved like they knew exactly where they were going and why. The team stayed hidden until the last figure passed. Morales said they were echoes, not ghosts, not alive, just trapped memories bleeding through a place that no longer respected time. They descended the ridge carefully and made their way along the western edge of the valley until they reached an old observation post buried in vines and broken metal. Inside, they found an audio recorder still intact, and when Thomas pressed play, it let out a burst of static, followed by a single voice repeating one phrase over and over. "He walks behind me. He walks behind me. He walks behind me." The tape looped for 3 minutes, and then went silent. They didn't take the recorder. They left it playing. Outside, Morales pointed to the tree line, where something stood watching, not hidden, just waiting, tall, thin, no face only, cloth wrapped tightly around where a face should be. Thomas raised his weapon. It didn't move. The lieutenant gave the order to fall back slowly, and they did. But every time Thomas looked away and looked back, it had taken a step closer. Not fast, not aggressive, just inevitable. When they finally lost sight of it behind the trees, Morales said it wasn't following them, it was guiding them. And Thomas believed him because something in his chest had already accepted that they weren't walking toward survival. They were walking toward revelation, toward whatever the jungle wanted them to remember. They followed the tree line west until the light started to shift and the sun disappeared faster than it should have, like the sky wanted to hide what was about to happen, and the path ahead curved slightly left, leading them toward a ridge Thomas recognized from a photo he had seen in a classified file years ago. One that had no context and no author, just a single line typed below it that read, "Origin unknown." The slope was steep, and the dirt was soft, and the trees leaned inward, as if the forest was closing behind them, and the wind blew once, but it didn't carry air, it carried sound voices. Not loud, not clear, just broken, like old recordings playing from inside stone. Morales stumbled once, then froze mid-step, and said he felt something pass through him, like a shadow made of weight, and heat, and cold at the same time, and Thomas didn't question it, because he had felt it too. At the base of the ridge, they found a row of bones lined perfectly along the trail, not scattered, not chewed, not aged, just arranged clean white, pointing forward, and each one marked with the same vertical line through a circle. The same symbol from the grave, the same mark from the chair, the same one burned into the back of Thomas's memory since the beginning. The lieutenant hesitated, but they kept walking, because turning around now didn't feel like an option. Not just because of the mission, but because the jungle no longer allowed it. They entered a clearing where the air felt still and dead, and in the center stood a metal post with dozens of dog tags hanging from it, all different years, all different units. Some scratched out, some melted, some still wet with something that looked like sweat or blood or something older. Thomas stepped forward and his breath caught, because hanging from the post was a tag with his name on it. Not a copy, not a fake, his actual tag. The one he had lost in Afghanistan 8 years ago, during a blackout mission that never went public, and the only person who could have recovered it was declared missing, presumed dead. He took it slowly and didn't speak, and the moment his fingers touched the cold metal, the post vibrated. Just once, then stopped, and the wind blew again, carrying that same sound, the broken recordings. The fractured voices, all whispering the same thing in overlapping tones, a phrase not in English, not in any language, yet Thomas understood it clearly, and so did Morales, and so did the lieutenant, because they all turned at the same time and stared into the trees, where a shape stood tall, wide, veiled like smoke, wrapped in skin and cloth and memory, and it didn't move, it didn't blink, it didn't breathe, but they all felt it watching, not like prey, but like something it had called home. The shape didn't speak, and it didn't move, but they all knew it had been waiting for them, and its presence felt heavier than the ground itself, like the jungle had poured every secret into that single figure, and now it stood silently demanding to be remembered. Thomas stepped forward slowly, one hand on his rifle, the other clenched into a fist, not out of fear, but to keep from shaking, because the moment he locked eyes with the veil, his body froze, not from control, but from recognition. Morales whispered that he had seen this figure before in a fever dream back in basic training, and again in the silence after his first kill, and again 2 nights ago when he heard breathing beneath the earth. The lieutenant raised his weapon, but Thomas lowered it, because he knew instinctively that this thing wasn't here to fight. It was here to show. The trees around them bent slightly inward, as if leaning to listen, and the wind dropped to nothing. The figure raised one arm and pointed toward the path ahead, where the earth was split open like a scar, wide and dark, and breathing. Thomas led them down, and the shape vanished behind them without a sound, and no one turned to check, because they already knew it was gone. The split in the earth led into a cavern that looked too symmetrical to be natural, and the deeper they went, the warmer it became, like heat rising from buried machines still alive after decades of silence. At the base of the tunnel was a door, made of metal and stone marked with the same symbol, and next to it lay a pile of journals, photos, maps, all burned at the edges, all soaked through with age. Thomas picked up one and flipped through its ruined pages, and saw faces, dates, locations that matched stories erased from military records decades ago, and one photo showed him standing in a place he had never been, surrounded by men he had never met, and yet he knew it was real. The lieutenant looked at Thomas, then at the door, then at the pendant around his neck, and said nothing, because some things don't need words to be true. The door slid open without touch, and behind it was a light that didn't flicker and didn't hum. It just existed, waiting. They stepped through together, and the door closed behind them. Inside the room, the light had no source and no shadow, and it felt like standing inside memory, not space. The walls pulsed gently as if breathing, and the floor below them was smooth black stone, covered in faint markings, none of them human, but still familiar. Morales stepped forward and whispered that he could hear his own voice, but it was coming from behind the wall, saying things he hadn't said yet. Thomas scanned the room and found a pedestal in the center. On it was a single tape recorder, no wires, no power, still playing. The voice on the tape was his own, telling the story of this mission before it happened, describing every step they had taken, even the parts no one had spoken aloud. The lieutenant backed away fast and said this place wasn't built to trap bodies. It was built to preserve thoughts. Thomas played the tape through. At the end, it simply said, "Return to the tree." The walls grew brighter. The room began to hum. They didn't speak. They just turned around and walked back through the door. The jungle was different when they stepped out. The trees stood taller. The air was colder, and the sky was darker than it should have been. Morales said he could feel something had been taken from him, but he didn't know what. Thomas looked down and saw footprints in the mud that matched their own, but were already dry, like they had walked this path days ago. They followed the prints without speaking, not because they were scared, but because the silence now felt necessary. At the edge of the forest they found the tree, the same one from the satellite photo, the same one that never showed up on the ground. But it was real, standing tall, covered in tags and worn-out boots, tied to the branches like ornaments of memory. Thomas walked to the base and placed the pendant there. The wind picked up for the first time in hours, and the jungle finally exhaled. The moment the pendant touched the roots, the tree shifted, not visibly, but the air around it pulsed once like a silent heartbeat, and Thomas stepped back slowly. Morales dropped to his knees, not from pain, but like something inside him had ended. The lieutenant whispered that the mission was done, but no one believed that. Not really, because the wind carried a new sound now. Not voices, not machines, but music. A slow, haunting note, like a memory being played backward. From the base of the tree, a light grew upward, pale and steady, and then the forest began to fade. Not disappear, fade, like an old photo left in the sun too long. They didn't run, they just stood still and watched it all blur. Thomas blinked and the forest was gone, replaced by white, endless, no sound, no wind, no ground beneath his boots, yet he remained standing. Morales was there beside him, so was the lieutenant, but they didn't speak, couldn't. In front of them stood the same chair from the underground room, except now it was clean, new, waiting, and beside it stood a figure not covered this time. No cloth, just smooth skin where no face should be. It raised one hand, pointed at the chair, then at Thomas. He didn't move, he didn't resist. He walked forward, slowly, calmly, as if he had always known this was where the path ended, or began. Thomas sat in the chair. The straps did not move, the figure did not speak. The light above grew warmer, and then everything stopped. No sound, no breath, just stillness. A silence so deep it felt like the world had closed its eyes. He looked straight ahead, and in that moment, he saw it all. Every mission buried, every name erased, every soldier who vanished without a trace, all of them watching, all of them waiting, not for rescue, but for someone to understand. The jungle had never taken them. It had remembered them, preserved them, etched them into its roots. And now Thomas was part of that memory. The light blinked once. Then darkness returned. The chair was empty. The forest was silent again. Somewhere far away, a radio crackled, unanswered. If this story stayed with you, even after the screen went dark, then remember, some memories are not meant to be erased, they are meant to be heard, one soldier at a time, one forgotten mission at a time. We are the Forgotten Front, and we are just getting started. Subscribe now, because history doesn't whisper here, it echoes.